Hey everybody. I often spend time talking about language and some of the peculiar features which I think underneath them, if we want to use this lens, because it can be useful to do so, if we look at there's a set theoretic aspect to language. Yet, even in the written form, I don't think it's set theoretic to the degree that set theory encompasses the essence and opportunities and nature of language. Yeah. And language and knowledge are relative. Now, of course, it can be useful if I were lecturing rather than sort of exploring. I might try to offer context local definitions for what I mean by language and what I mean by knowledge. And that's useful because as broad generalizations, they're incredibly vague. In fact, they're vague enough that whatever meaning might attach to them in our thought, in our imagination, is almost arbitrary. It's kind of throwing a penny in a pond. But I'm not lecturing, I'm just exploring. So by language, oh gosh, how am I going to define this? I've set myself a pretty trap here. So maybe I'll just say that I'm using the terms rather casually for the moment, so that they refer to what they ordinarily refer. This doesn't resolve the problem I previously framed. It decides to be at ease with it for the moment. I think I try to reflect deeply on problems related to not just the nature of knowledge, but the seemingly endless peculiar forms of, distinguishable kinds, if you will, of knowledge. And I think generally the conceptual kind, and also to some degree, perhaps not completely, the rational kind of knowledge. And not merely knowledge, but behaviors around, because the knowledge doesn't exist abstractly from the humans. Even if there are eternal forms or something, right? It's still, for us humans, knowledge will refer to things humans can know, right? Or have experienced knowing. And some of that's axiomatic, right? We will claim to know something because we laid down axioms under which we decided knowledge was possible. And then, having accomplished such provisions, we declare the result in consciousness or awareness, memory, language, so on, knowledge. And as I mentioned before, it's not my intention to survey or inventory the kinds of knowledge, the different modes of knowing. We can see in our culture different ways of knowing, for example. This is a useful side branch, but science, or scientific endeavor, more appropriately, is a way of knowing. Artistic endeavor is a way of knowing. Literate endeavors, academic endeavors in general. These explore specific branches of ways of knowing according to the contexts that they've acquired, the structural persona of over time. Engineering is a way of knowing. Mathematics is a way of knowing. Physical embodiment, non-verbally, just the felt sense of being an organism and a human organism, is a way of knowing. Dreaming is somehow, I think, a way of knowing with a important asterisk next to it. Though that asterisk can transform in many ways. And all of these ways of knowing can be thought of as unique transformations of imaginal assets. And I think even without imagination, our memory might be useless. Imagination is another one of these general terms that is very confusing because it's quite challenging. And I think we should pause for a moment with wonder and awe and maybe even reverence to try to think about what it is that is being pointed at when we use this word imagine, to imagine, or imagination. And again, there's a jungle of different modes or kinds we can distinguish. Yet the general term is not entirely without meaning, right? It's still meaningful. Even though we can also say, well, what does imagination mean? But in some sense, for me, it is the strange and actually mysterious inner theater in awareness. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the problem for me is I have wonder and reverence and awe for this thing. And I'm disinclined to try to frame it in language in general because of this. It's sort of the heart or inhabited living space of the mind. And yet, we can't really entirely disentangle it from memory. It responds to our intention, yet most of us cannot merely command it with our intention. Unlike, for example, my hand. It partakes of capacities familiar from dreaming. And yet what we mean when we say imagine, in English, this word has the connotations, the verb, of making pictures, right? Of generating scenes or images. Yet, there's something truly mysterious and astonishing here. If we take this faculty, right, we don't even have to take it away. If we just modulate it slightly in one direction in humans, none of our, like a completely different set of developmental timelines, right, would have ensued. Like, you could probably turn off human intelligence just by slightly messing with imagination. Not that that's how I ordinarily think of it. In fact, that idea never occurred to me before, just now. And of course, our environments do radically impose extremely narrow contexting structures, right, into which we are in danger of collapsing over time. Conceptual knowledge troubles me for simple reasons. It easily acquires the appearance of conclusivity, right? This is so. And once that selection, once that particular once we select that destination, right, in traveling, in consciousness or awareness or thought, however self-satisfying it might immediately seem, and that's one of the really dangerous aspects of knowledge, the sort of intuited, the stealth attachment of knowledge is blindness, right? And there are varieties of knowledge that are resistant to this, but I think they tend to, and I try to practice something along these lines, they tend to keep a big space open for incompleteness, right? They realize, like, okay, we've got a couple of views on a tiny little fraction of a phenomenon. We don't know the antecedents, right? We don't know what is actually going on, but we've got this little grasp on a range of stuff we can make metrics about and measure, and very useful. But the fact even that we have theories that are highly correct, relativity is impressively correct about computations regarding the topics it covers, the reference frame is missing. We don't. With all of, in this sense, knowledge is fundamentally provisional for a really peculiar reason. We don't know the first thing. And that seemingly modest, tiny little insight, statable in a sentence a child could understand, and yet overlook. It's really easy to hear such simple words and then, just dismiss it. And of course, it's my responsibility to keep it interesting enough that you can't. But not yours necessarily, although you've got a role in it. Um, we don't understand the reference frame. We engineered frameworks that we could use and sort of fill in, right, and test. And we engineered them from perspectives familiar to us and novel, yet not so novel as to be unintelligible. And that's a crude way of describing the process, but what I'm trying to say is that the knowledge landscape includes both insights and occlusions that are like traditionally believed. And we're all kind of intuitively aware of this. This in no way invalidates valid scientific work or findings. Quite the opposite. It sets them in a more trustworthy context. Science is a process, and as it proceeds, it tries to divest itself of myths, so to speak, and advance beyond previous, reference frames. So we went from we added, dimensionality and all kinds of things, though it wasn't we precisely that did this. These things in the development of our physical sciences, there were sort of evolutionary landmarks, right? That could very crudely be, painted as like Newton, relativity, quantum mechanics. And you can see the radical transformation of knowledge over time. And extremely counterintuitive ideas were introduced to the point, to the degree that there was kind of a crisis in the human knowledge landscape in two ways that are really interesting. Both of them are interesting to me. We failed to transfer fundamental insights about time and identity and locale and context from Einstein and relativity from Einstein into ordinary thought about identity and categories, and because relativity should have revised our relationship with the way we understand what the categories refer to. Even the categories we already have, not to mention we might have invented some new ones, right? That were the result of the insights incumbent from relativity. And this largely never happened. So linguistically, one might say that we have a kind of a problem of a hidebound traditionalism in thought and knowledge about identity and relation. We still tend to think in, and our categories have the character of Newtonian physics, or even, before that, right? So that stuff kind of never got updated. And there's another universe here going on that's invisible to us because of what's occluded, right? By not so much exactly by our language, but by the way our understandings of the meanings of categories and their members are too narrow. They've lost dimensionality over the development of more structured human consciousness. They've lost degrees of liberty, they've lost depth and richness, they've become very sort of declarative, conceptual, oh, trees are, plants, plants are things, living things, or, whatever, non-sentient. You can just chop them up and do whatever you want with them. And animals are pretty much the same thing, but a little more, this kind of stuff. There's a reductionist inclination, right, in not just the knowledge landscape, but the dominant elements or terrains or manifolds within the knowledge landscape. And all of this knowledge is provisional. It's as if our species if you can imagine a human child that was raised by humans enough to gain language, but really had no one to talk to and no one to ask questions of, right? Got to tie my shoe, one moment. So, in a way, one could imagine our species as an intelligent... I sometimes like to imagine it this way. Maybe I should be more general. It was as if we didn't have parents, right? Our intelligence was born... I don't actually think this way. But you can imagine a science fiction story where, and of course this has been done, David Brin, for example, has this concept of uplift, where intelligent species have an uplift parent, right? Another intelligent species sort of carries them far enough up the ladder that they then will proceed, somewhat on their own. And it's as if our species, in our childlike, astonishing potential, maybe had some kind of access to another intelligence, and I can point at some pretty obvious places where it might be found. Like nature, for example, older stuff, right? Living stuff that's older than us. That's part of the superorganism that we are an expression of, right? That's one place where you could look, but there might have been more places. In any case, over time, and I think, when you're with... Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if I can say that. Over time, the richness of the imaginal waters from which language emerged and for which language emerged, that richness lost dimensionality. Maybe it became, we could imagine it became very salty or something, but the original richness and diversity of association and connotation, meaningful, not abstract, not arbitrary. In our distant ancestors, I must anyway, imagine radically, it makes us look Well, many of our words lack fundamentally meaningful connotations in the first place, and they acquire abstract associations and connotations, as well as personal ones, throughout our lives, but probably most profusely during certain times in our childhood and maybe teenage years. Though some of that vitality, that learning motivation continues on into adulthood, at least for some of us, to some degree, in some forms. I was listening to a podcast and someone made a comment that I think was popular or probably made by a famous scientist or associated with them. And it was something like, I'll probably paraphrase it, my understandings are evidence-based. And here we see the collision, right, in a statement like this, of an underlying assumption of conceptual knowledge that is fundamentally dangerous. It's like a broken mine shaft, actually, that's been covered over, right? You're walking through a field. I've been in a field like this, right? At random places throughout the field, there's old degraded plywood covered up with dirt and grass and junk. And if you step on that stuff, it just shatters and drops you into, a 300-foot vertical mine shaft. And there's places like this in human cognition, and this is why I'm concerned, actually. And we fall into them all the time, but we don't have eyes there, so we mostly can't tell, And sometimes we just stay trapped down in the bottom for the rest of our lives. So... It's funny how thread memory works. It's very easy to lose a thread if I shift, for example, towards seeing humor in what I'm talking about, right? My focused mind, it plays with a certain kind of structure, and the humorous mind, the kind of structure it makes in imagination is very different. So I've momentarily lost my thread. Something very dangerous about cognition and conceptual cognition. I'll have to hope it'll return to me and proceed. Now I'll make a new path, I guess. So, us moderns, we grew up not knowing the first thing. And most of us had to kind of get off-the-shelf versions of the first thing. And what the first thing is, sort of, although ours are pretty wonky, it's what we might call, I refer to it as the unifor, like what the everything is, or one's worldview, right? The first thing is essentially, what's going on here. And human knowledge about that, particularly if you just generalize over the landscape rather than looking at specific mountains or valleys in that landscape, which is also useful, it's incredibly provisional. It looks like children's toys about something that really the first thing is not, nobody's got much of a, hold on it. Oh, right, evidence-led. Yeah, my understanding is the result of evidence. Yeah. Here's the problem with that. This is where two things collide. And one of them is language, and the other is knowledge. But underneath both of those, or around them, however you want to think about it, above them, there's a mostly inaccessible there's a partly accessible dimension of pre-structured potential. Like, it's not fully structured, but it acquires structure over time and begins to collapse toward form. Yeah. And everything, that's a wonderful toy about just about everything. And that pre-structured place is very interesting. But the problem with evidence leads my understanding, and I wish I had the exact quote because it sounded relatively absolute, which would be even more dangerous. The problem here is that there's a super frame, right? There's the next frame up from this form of thinking is what is thinking this? What am I thinking this with and for? And that frame is very peculiar and I think suspicious. Intrinsic to this declaration, and this is the covered mind shaft, is that evidence interprets itself, right? Evidence tells us what is true. Not so. There's no place that's so. And so, if we are to think about this more meaningfully, more intelligently, in a way that will return degrees of liberty, we will realize that evidence plus, human mind and imagination, right? And that's got features like motive, right? Purpose, why I'm here doing this in the first place. History, memory, imagination. This comes to life in imagination before it can be any part of our conscious experience. Just as my own talk is happening now, right? It's a very strange process when I think about it. There's an invisible turmoil, living storm inside my mind, right? And it's making these sort of little lightning things. This is just one way of imaging it. But yeah, it's making these little lightning things that eventually collapse down into structures of related ideas, and I can make face noises and move my hands around and stuff, and have fun and smile and be in the garden. It's good. Our knowledge is provisional, but it's very easy to fall into a kind of trance where even the simplest declarations that taken seriously would be seen to be impossible, it cannot be true. We take them not only as facts, but as arbiters of identity. I mean, if a mind is like a wing and a bird tried to do that with a wing, it would be an ugly, terrifying thing to behold. The bird would be attacking itself with its wing and doing every other thing but flying or even being able to walk. Yeah. But we humans have fallen into this sad, I think, and mostly unconscious relationship with language and knowledge. And so with understanding, because though there are nonverbal kinds of understanding, I would say, or at least I would use the word that way occasionally, the understanding that happens particularly when we use language together or are involved in languaging behavior together, that's a very peculiar thing. That's a truly remarkable thing. I mean, there's lots of features of humans that are quite remarkable if you compare them to the face of nature. I find it very difficult, though it might be healthy for me to do so, not to see us as profoundly privileged to have the lifespan that we have. Hands. I mean, wings are fabulous. Fins, brilliant. Pseudopods, tentacles, off the charts amazing. But these things are really, really weird in what they portend for the development of an animal, having an appendage like this, right? I started to say equipped with, because this is, a common thing to say in English, but there's a mechanical connotation there that it doesn't resonate for me. In fact, I'm very nervous about mechanical associations because the humans appear to be confused about what constitutes life. Or even mechanism. So, I was thinking the other night, because there's this trope where someone asks me, what do you know about thus and so? And I say, I don't know the first thing about it. And I suddenly realized, though maybe I've got a little exception here, as a regular modern human being, we don't know the first thing about anything at all. So there's still some way to make some kind of progress, or something resembling progress according to our definition of progress, to see better, to understand more deeply, to have more degrees of liberty in thought and relation, opportunity, problem solving. To progress. The problems exist in every language, but I think there were old languages that were so well aware of this that they really managed to conserve aspects of richness and dimensionality and connotation and association that inclined them to understand more subtle aspects of conceptual imagining and thought, and of naming. They were aware that somehow that with language they were playing with something at least half mysterious, like half secret, and probably really half divine, like partly from the universe of origin. A very unpredictably powerful new way of being in mind and of behaving and seeing and thinking. Now, of course, we would think that language doesn't affect what we physically see, but that's a tenuous assertion, even though it seems superficially true. The first thing. So if the first thing is missing, or if we take a kind of a doll of it that's maybe partly deformed and put it there because we don't have something from another intelligence that we trust, that could guide us and say, okay, well, we can't tell you what the first thing is, but look in this direction and it will become apparent, or something like this, right? At least. You can see how the entire tree of human knowledge is founded on a question mark. It doesn't mean there's nothing trustworthy in there. It means nobody knows the first thing about things. And language presents the opposite appearance. That not only has the first thing been known, the other important things have already been taken care of. These are pre-digested for you, and a token is spit out, tree, bird, money, right? Some token spit out, and that's all you need, right? Now you're good to go. Go where? For what? The world has been in conscious thought in some way, not in everyone. Some people still feel the strange living dimensionality of actual being to some degree, and some people are having delusions and some are hallucinating and whatever too, right? Like, it's all going on, everything, that we know about being human, all day, every day, billions of us. But the ideas of identity, the foundational ideas on which our understanding of what is possible are based. These things over time have shriveled into tiny, little, very narrow, just like the conceptual skeleton with no content much associated with it anymore. And just to be a little bit daring, it is clear to me from what I've been able to learn and also from direct experience that the living beings are something that if we got an even slightly clearer and deeper glimpse of, it would destroy all of our categories. It would show them all to have been crippling misconceptions, nearly all of them. And so, weirdly, our relationship with knowledge and language, I'm not concerned so much, obviously, about where it gives us insight, and it does. And I'm very happy about that, right? I'm fascinated by memory and language and knowledge and intelligence and questions and, chasing them and so on. Like a dog chasing cats, but I go after questions. Hopefully I'm not making too much noise. And the questions don't usually go up trees, but sometimes they do, actually, now that I think of it. We've been transmitting to our children a broken lexicon of categories and the associations appropriate to the root elements of the tree of categories from which we derive conceptual and linguistic identity. And those two things link together, they affect each other deeply. And language does not determine knowledge, nor does it determine what is seen, but it profoundly influences it, particularly in terms of what is seen in and or with language. But I think even beyond that. So one of my senses is that there's a better way to make the evidence statement, because evidence determines my understanding is woefully confused. Data has to be interpreted, it's pre-framed, purposively, it's purposively reframed. The motive, right, goes into the interpretations. And data is also incomplete and partial. And collecting data about something probably changes the something you're collecting data about. It probably changes you, right? We can't, there's no way to be in research without affecting that which is researched and being affected by doing research, right? Because that frame, its purposes and conserved starting perspectives are selective and utilitarian, and by selective I mean they're carefully selected tools of thought, right? Established traditions of evaluation, statistics, p-values, and so on. I pay attention to evidence, and well-evidenced arguments are likely to influence me. Yet I'm also aware that we don't know the first thing. And so, in a way, knowledge is provisional. That doesn't necessarily lead me to oppose I'm in no way in opposition to the rational inclusion and interpretation of evidence about, some claim. Right? But I'm also aware that we're sort of stumbling around in the dark, and we often get things actually backwards, like 180 degrees wrong, quite frequently. And over time, maybe sometimes we discover this in particular areas of research. I was thinking of an example from biology. And we also overlook stuff. Our science, it's not... Let's say that its coverage is wildly incomplete. We're very curious about specific phenomena, and we've got some modest early days coverage of that stuff. I mean, it looks very good to us because it gives us the capacity to physically manipulate forces and constituents of matter and things like this. So that looks really, powerful. But we still don't know what the first thing is, so we don't know what we're manipulating. And if you don't know what you're manipulating, it's reasonable to have some concern about the other parts of your knowledge, right? About its peculiar provisionality. It's not as firmly established as language presents it, and nor can language encompass the actual depth of phenomenal experience as an organism. There won't be a single description. And metaphors are often far more enlightening than declarations. Of course, there I made a declaration rather than a metaphor. And, there's a problem here about belief. Right? Because belief is a really weird aspect of relation with knowledge. I might be inclined to believe one of my ideas or thoughts or models to some degree, right? I find such a thing useful or valid or beautiful or capable of giving me perspectives otherwise very difficult for me to experience. But that doesn't mean I take it as factual. I'm inclined not to believe it much because it's my experience that whatever it is that might be going on with me and you and the universe and time, space, and all these things, it's deeply, profoundly different from the world of language and concepts. And I suspect that even its relationship with mathematics is much stranger than anything we'd be likely to imagine. So for me, there's fundamental inclusion of this sort of mysterious incompleteness that is accessible to us because we're an expression of this, moment to moment, right? Our minds, our imaginations, and so on. These are, I won't say they're properties of this living, mysterious, pre-forming potential, but they're children of it, it seems. Or I like to think this way. Now, do I believe that? Well, I'm inclined, I like the idea, and it's useful to me in various ways. I certainly don't believe that it encompasses, and it could even be largely wrong. The other kind of weird thing about knowledge is learning is such a strange process, and a process that I think often requires as if, like being in the world as if I am a musician or an elf or a whale or a tree, or a soul. So there's this aspect of our learning that requires as if imaginal play, right? Not entirely dissimilar from what went on as children. And the context that we're in, they're not very friendly to that, to put it mildly. I always mostly disregarded that unfriendliness. But that can be very dangerous. It can get one in trouble. I think my point was, sometimes, like, the path to an insight of some kind, right? To awakening, to sudden understanding, deeper understanding, it often, the ladder that gets us there contained wildly wrong things, like stuff that was just like, nope. Now, I'm not claiming those were necessary, but it turns out that often, in most cases, like I had to stand on some idea or belief for many years that was completely fallacious, or, at least pretty, highly questionable, put it that way. And, from there I would move to a position where I could see better and understand more deeply, or more broadly, or more usefully, right? So the weird thing is that we don't just go from, rung 1 to rung 970, although we can make leaps. I think it's just really important to have the freedom to get it wrong on the way to getting it better. And this can be troubling because there are things that are really relatively simple to do the first time you try them, even though there's nuance you can acquire over time. But there are other things that are essentially almost impossible to do the first time you try them. And they don't even seem like things that can be done after trying them. I know, because I've tried some of these. So there's a weird barrier of kind of tension in the beginning of the process where one's pushing against the possibility of acquiring skill and just failing, right? failing. And there's a few branches of human activity where this turns out to be really important, this failing. I'll leave them as mysteries for the listener to consider. It would be very uncouth of me to say, indelicate and irreverent, to say what the first thing is. Though I have some peculiar relationship with this problem, personally. But I might say that there's something about transformations of potential and opportunity as something transcendentally unified, which is a very difficult thing to explain because it's not simple. It's just one thing, but if there's a transcendental unity, this can be enriched by unity in distinction, like we have sort of in the physical universe. And even if there's no transcendental unity, like if that did not precede life on Earth, around here, it seems the natural outcome of the existence of our ecologies and what they actually are expressions of, as opposed to our very limited modern. Like in some ways our modern stories are so limiting that you'd be better off with a fairy tale, right? Because at least a fairy tale has mystery associated with it, fundamentally, right? And removing that is a very cruel amputation, and unjustifiable. You can remove it momentarily for clinical stuff, right, for academic stuff, but you'd better like put it back in at some point and say, yes, and the mystery still prevails over the, tiny little scratchings in the dirt we've managed to make and have gotten maybe a little too excited about. We can make far better scratchings if making good scratchings is what, we're after. But not the way we're at it mostly presently, unfortunately. A bat. Unfortunately, our language and knowledge have sort of dominated us, and they're very kind of crude, broken forms as masses of people. And there are those populations of people who are brilliant and insightful and imaginative and creative, or at least very learned, right? Intelligent, have acquired wisdom. But most of this is hidden from us, right? And it's only kind of disseminated through, authorized channels, so to speak. In other words, channels to which are being converted into commodity by someone, something. There's a vast richness of accessible dimensionality to what's happening, to what we are seeing and aware of when we're awake, that our waking mind is ill-equipped to introduce us to, and it has another reason why it doesn't want to. It will lose its sovereignty. As if it were, I'm anthropomorphizing the mind, but I'm just playing around. But as if it were a guy with a job, right? Or a girl with a job, or someone with a job, that depends on keeping all those crystallized, narrow skeletons of meaning and identity in dominance. Because if some of the actual living mystery were to leak into our awareness while we are awake, it would immediately overwhelm the dominion of that guy, and he would lose his job. And so he would no longer be able to corner the resources of consciousness to keep producing these collapsed skeletal frames that are uninhabitable for the imagination, and for, largely for relation. And as modernity proceeds, more and more of this gets translated into, it just gets converted into transactions, and we stop, we don't have relations anymore. We just have sort of a ticker tape thing, right? Of little tokenized, one of, it's funny, I picked up the habits of podcasters I've listened to, and that's not a good thing. I was listening to Yosha Bach on a podcast the other day, and he said a variety of extremely interesting things. Incredibly intelligent guy, which by no means do I agree with everything he has to say. Maybe I should go back toward the light. And he was saying something like, the United States has become this nation of like transactional documentation, right? This is what everyone does. They document transactions all day, like every day. And I think what he's speaking generally, but he's saying that's a really strange thing to do, and it's a dangerous investment of attention. And I agree with him about that. And it's a really bizarre thing to do. But that's the kind of thing, an aspect of the waking anatomy, the waking mind's anatomy, an aspect of that anatomy is really into, do the accounting to the last digit. And part of the reason it's into that is you can do the accounting on having done the accounting, right? So you can keep acquiring dominance in the hierarchy, in the momentary, interplay of the organs. You can keep acquiring dominance and steal more sort of juice for your projects and so on. And if the actual, if anything resembling the actual character and depth of nature were to intrude into the mind momentarily of a modern adult human who was unfamiliar with it, I'm fairly sure it would be a crisis unless the tenor of the contact were so very gentle and tentative and sort of loving and receptive and inviting, in which case you might maybe it would be less of a crisis and more of a miracle. And sometimes that's the difference between insight and insanity. Or so it seems, though again, I mistrust the language wildly in such matters. But yeah, if we don't know the first thing, if we don't really know what everything is, and what it's doing, and where it comes from, and it should tell us its story. We need to ask the story of everything. and not in numbers, in relationships. If the universe is, if there are layers of consciousness and awareness above and beyond our own, which I have a very difficult time thinking is not the case, I can entertain the thought. They're contactable, and their intelligences are not like our language. And I think a long time ago, the humans, the old humans, they knew that all of life and all of time and space was a network, and it was as if it were one organism, one family, with a tree of many branches, and that they could travel in that network with an aspect of their being that had always done that and is deeply familiar with all of this. That aspect is not the thinky, conceptual, waking mind. And even that, whatever it is I'm referring to there, it depends on things far stranger and more astonishing than we would suppose for its own capacity to limit the structure, right? To collapse things down into tokens and string them into sentences, and to pretend that declarations encompass identity and stuff like that. And you can see the problem with this whole idea of declarations encompassing identity in the modern, identity politics cluster storm. Sun is setting. Thank you. More soon, I hope. Bye-bye for now.